There was once a man whose music could do what no army, no god, and no king had ever managed. When he played, wild animals lay down together in peace. Rivers paused in their courses to listen. Trees uprooted themselves and leaned in closer, and the stones on the hillside are said to have gathered around him like an audience. And there came a day when that music did something greater still. It walked into the kingdom of the dead, and it made the king of that kingdom weep, and it nearly persuaded death itself to give something back. This is a story about how close a man came to breaking the one law that has never, in all of human history, been broken. And it is a story about the single human moment that undid it all at the very last step. To understand how someone could come so close to defeating death, we have to start with the strange and singular gift he was given at birth. A gift that made him, long before any of this happened, the most beloved mortal in Greece. His name was Orpheus, and he was said to be the son of Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, the eldest and most eloquent of the 9 sisters who inspired every art the Greeks ever practiced. Some say his father was a king of Thrace, a wild and mountainous land at the edge of the Greek world, known for its fierce warriors and its strange, ecstatic religious rites. Others say the god Apollo himself was his true father, and gave him, as a gift, the first lyre he ever owned. An instrument, some say, with strings of pure gold, small enough for a child's hands, and yet already capable, from the very first note he ever drew from it, of silencing an entire room. His mother, they say, sang him the great deeds of heroes as lullabies, before he could even speak, and perhaps it was there, in the crib long before he understood a single word, that the shape of every epic ever sung first entered him, the way the shape of the sea enters a shell left too long upon the shore. Whichever telling you, believe, the truth of Orpheus was written plainly in what he could do, from the moment he was old enough to hold that lyre. Music came out of him the way breath comes out of an ordinary man, not as a skill he had practiced, but as something closer to his own nature. It is worth pausing to imagine what this gift must actually have looked like, because we are so used to hearing the greatest musician who ever lived as a simple compliment that we forget how strange, how nearly supernatural the old stories insist it truly was. When Orpheus sang of grief, grown warriors who had marched through the horrors of battle without flinching would find themselves in tears before they understood why. When he sang of joy, the driest, most cynical old men in the room would find themselves smiling like children. And when he simply played, wandering the hills of Thrace, with his lyre slung over his shoulder, the natural order of the world itself seemed to bend gently toward him. Wolves walked beside deer without hunting them. Birds circled overhead in patterns that seemed, if only for a moment, deliberate, as though they too were trying to keep time. There is an old story, told across the hills of Thrace long after his death, of a grove of trees that stood in a perfect circle around the flat stone where Orpheus used to sit and play in the evenings, trees that had, quite literally, uprooted themselves and shuffled across the earth over the course of many patient years, to arrange themselves within hearing distance of him, and that remained standing in that same possible circle for generations after he was gone, as though still waiting for a song that would never come again. The Greeks did not consider this decoration on top of his talent. They considered it evidence of something true about the deepest nature of music itself, that at its purest, it does not merely describe the world, but reaches into it and moves it. Orpheus's fame eventually reached far beyond the borders of Thrace, and When the hero Jason gathered together to sail in search of the golden fleece, he made certain to bring Orpheus along, not as a warrior, but as something the ship could not sail without. And it was on that voyage that Orpheus's gift proved itself in a way no sword or shield ever could. As the great ship Argo passed the deadly island of the Sirens, whose song lured sailors to their deaths on the rocks, it was not wax in the ears, nor ropes upon the mast, that saved that crew, as it would for another hero on another voyage many years later. It was Orpheus himself who lifted his own lyre and played a song so much more beautiful, so much richer and more alive than the Sirens' deadly melody, that his music simply drowned theirs out entirely, and the whole crew sailed past that fatal shore in perfect safety, listening only to him. Even the monsters of the sea, it seemed, could be answered with a song, if the song was beautiful enough. The other heroes on that ship, men who had wrestled bulls and fought off armies born from dragons' teeth, are said to have simply sat in stunned silence at their oars, watching this one man do, with a song, what none of their combined strength could have managed at all. It is worth remembering that voyage and that triumph, because it will return to us, transformed into something far darker, before this story is through. For on that ship, Orpheus's music was strong enough to defeat a monster's song outright. What lay ahead of him would ask something far harder of it, not to overpower an enemy, but to persuade a friend who could not be persuaded, and to soothe a grief that no melody, however perfect, could ever fully silence. And there is a bitter symmetry worth noticing here, one the old poets surely intended, even if they never said it outright. On that ship, Orpheus's music had been strong enough to make a monster's song simply irrelevant, drowned out entirely by something more beautiful. But grief does not work the way a siren's call works. It cannot be drowned out by beauty, however overwhelming, because grief is not competing for his attention from somewhere outside him. It lives inside the very same chest that makes the music. He was about to learn that the hardest audience he would ever have to move was not a monster, or even a god. It was his own aching heart, which no lyre, however golden, can fully silence from within. But even the greatest gift in the world is only half a life without someone to share it with. And it was some time after his return from that great voyage that Orpheus met the woman who would complete him. Her name was Eurydice, a dryad, one of the gentle spirits of the forest, as woven into the wild, growing world as Orpheus's music was woven into the hearts of men. The old stories do not linger long on the details of their courtship, but they do not need to. It is enough to know that here were two beings, each already halfway to something beyond the ordinary human, who found in each other a completion so total that their wedding day was remembered by everyone who attended it as one of the most joyful anyone had ever seen. Orpheus played, of course, and it is said that even the god of marriage himself, Hymen, who attended their wedding with his usual torch, found that torch smoking and sputtering strangely throughout the ceremony, refusing to burn with its usual clean, bright flame, a small, uneasy omen that no one in their joy that day cared to examine too closely. The wedding guests, gathered from villages across Thrace and beyond, would later say they remembered that flickering, guttering torch clearly, the way people so often claim, after a tragedy, to have noticed the warning all along. But on the day itself, surrounded by music that made the very air feel warmer, no one wanted to be the one to name the shadow, crossing so briefly over such perfect happiness. Grief, when it is still only a possibility, is so much easier to laugh away than to face. It should have been the happiest chapter of an already remarkable life. And for one single day it was. But the old stories are full of days like this, golden, complete, and unrepeatable, that exist only to be shattered in the very next breath, so that everything that follows can be measured against how much was lost. On that very same day, or very soon after, as Eurydice wandered through a meadow with her new husband's love still fresh around her like warmth from a fire, a man named Aristeus, a shepherd, and, in some tellings, a minor god of the countryside, saw her and was overcome with a desire he had no right to act on. He was known, in the years that followed, as a gentle patron of beekeepers and herdsmen, a god of quiet, useful things. And it is one of the smaller cruelties of this story that so ordinary and so unremarkable a figure should be the one whose careless pursuit set the whole tragedy in motion, rather than any great villain worthy of the devastation that followed. He pursued her through the grass, and Eurydice, frightened, fled from him, without looking at what lay in the tall grass beneath her feet. And there, hidden in the green, was a serpent. She stepped upon it, and it struck, and the venom did what venom does, swiftly and without mercy, and Eurydice, a bride of less than a day, fell to the earth and did not rise again. Her companions, the other nymphs of the wood who had danced at her wedding only hours before, found her there among the trampled grass, and it was their grief, rising together in one long unbroken cry across the hillside, that first carried the news back to Orpheus before a single messenger could words themselves. He is said to have known, from the sound alone, carried on the wind from far off, exactly what had happened, long before he ever saw her face. There is nothing that can prepare a heart for grief that arrives with that particular cruelty. Grief that lands not after a long illness, not after a battle, a man expected to be dangerous, but out of an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of the single happiest week of an entire life. Orpheus's sorrow, when it came, was reported to be as extraordinary as his joy had been. He is said to have wept for so long, and so completely, that his songs of mourning reached the ears of the gods themselves on Olympus, and moved even the coldest of them to something like pity. But pity from the gods, however genuine, does not raise the dead. And Orpheus, alone now in a way he had never once been alone before, even in the wildest hills of Thrace, understood with a terrible clarity that grieving was not going to be enough. If his music could calm wild beasts, and drown out the song of monsters, and move gods to tears from a mountain away, then perhaps, and this was the thought that must have both terrified and steadied him, perhaps it could do one thing more. Perhaps it could walk where no living voice had ever successfully pleaded before, and ask simply for her back. He did not arrive at this thought quickly or lightly. The old stories tell us he sat for days beside her grave, playing nothing at all, as though even his own gift had momentarily failed him before the idea took hold. And when it did, it must have felt less like a plan and more like the only door left standing in a house that grief had otherwise burned entirely to the ground. The idea alone should have been unthinkable. Every soul that has ever crossed into the kingdom of the dead has crossed in one direction only. The Greeks did not tell stories of heroes who casually strolled into the underworld and negotiated their way back out with the people they loved. They told stories, instead, of the vanishingly rare few who managed even to enter and return alone, shaken and changed. To go down into that gray and silent country and ask its king to simply hand back a soul he had already claimed was not merely difficult. It was, by every law the Greeks understood about the shape of the universe, impossible. But Orpheus, we should remember, had already once done something the world considered impossible. He had outsung monsters, whose song was said to be irresistible to any living man. And so, with nothing left to lose, and with a devotion that the old poets clearly meant us to find both magnificent and slightly reckless, Orpheus took up his lyre one final time and set out for the one door in all the world that was not supposed to open both ways. The road down was as terrible as every soul who ever walked it has described. He came at last to the edge of the great gray river that rings the underworld, and there waited Charon, the ancient ferryman, who had refused passage to living souls since the very beginning of his long service, for it was his one unbending task to keep the world of the living and the world of the dead forever separate. Orpheus did not argue with him, and he did not attempt to bribe him, for he had no coin that could buy what he needed. Instead, he lifted his lyre, and he played. And the old ferryman, who had heard nothing in all his endless years but the fearful murmuring of the newly dead, found himself, for the first time in memory, simply listening, moved by a beauty he had no name for, in a place where beauty of that kind had never once been permitted. Charon's own oar, the old stories say, faltered mid-stroke as he listened, as though the ancient ferryman had for one unguarded moment forgotten the single unbroken rule of his entire endless existence. He had rowed emperors and beggars alike across that water without ever once looking up from his task. He looked up now, and without a word he rowed the living man across. On the far shore waited Cerberus, the three-headed hound, who guarded the gates of the underworld, whose task was to let every soul in, and to let none of them out, tearing to pieces anything living that tried to cross in the wrong direction. Every hero who had ever faced that hound had faced it with strength, or with cunning, or with brute force, wrestling it into submission by main power alone, one, in a labor still spoken of throughout Greece, had dragged the beast bodily up into the world of the living, with nothing but his bare hands and his own enormous strength, and even that had cost him everything he had. Orpheus faced it with none of these. He simply played, and the great hound, whose three heads had never once in their existence heard anything but the growls of the dead and the cries of the damned, lay down before him instead, all three heads lowering together in a strange and unwilling peace, and let him pass untouched. The old stories linger on this moment with a kind of wonder, describing the great hound's three heads drooping in unison, its usual furious growl, softening into something almost like the low, contented sound a dog makes when a beloved master returns after a long absence, as though, for the length of that song, the hound had briefly forgotten every violent purpose it had ever been bred for, and remembered only the simple pleasure of being sung to. It is worth pausing on this, because it tells us something the whole story is quietly building toward. Every guardian of that terrible place, the ferryman sworn to serve only the dead, the hound bred for nothing but violence, set aside the one function that defined its entire existence, however briefly, because of a song. If music could do this to a monster with three heads, what might it do to a king with a heart? It is worth remembering, too, that Hades was not merely stern. He was, by every account the Greeks ever told of him, the one god in the whole of creation, who had never once been known to bend the rules of his own kingdom. For anyone, mortal or immortal, however powerful, however beloved, even his own brother Zeus, king of all the heavens, had no authority within those gray walls. whatever was about to happen in that throne room. It would happen because a song alone had done what no god, no hero, and no law had ever managed before. Deeper still he went, into the heart of that silent kingdom, past the judges, who weighed the lives of the dead, past the pale, drifting shades of the ordinary departed in their gray meadows, and into the throne room of Hades himself, Lord of the dead, and his queen, Persephone, who sat beside him. And there, at last, Orpheus did the thing no mortal before him had ever successfully done. He did not beg. He did not threaten, for what threat could a mortal possibly make against the two beings who ruled over every soul that had ever lived or died? Instead, he played for them the whole of his grief, transformed into music, the joy of his wedding day, the horror of the serpent in the grass, the unbearable silence of the world without Eurydice in it, all of it poured out through his lyre in the throne room of death itself. He is said to have sung, too, of something else entirely, not a demand, but an offer, a quiet acknowledgement that everyone in that room, sooner or later, would belong to this kingdom, regardless of what Hades decided that day. He was not asking to cheat death of what was owed to it. He was asking only for a little more time before that debt came due, the same request, in truth, that every grieving heart that has ever lived has silently made of the universe, and almost never received. And it is said that as he played, even Hades, the coldest and most unmovable of all the gods, the one being in the entire cosmos who had never once been known to show mercy to anyone, felt something in his ancient heart give way. The old stories tell us that the Furies themselves, the terrible goddesses of vengeance, whose faces are said to be wreathed in serpents, and whose very presence brings the guilty to their knees in dread, wept openly for the first time since the world began. Sisyphus, condemned to push his boulder up the same hill for all eternity, is said to have simply sat down upon it and listened. Tantalus, tormented forever by food and water forever out of reach, forgot his hunger and his thirst entirely for the length of that single song. Even Ixion, bound to his ceaselessly spinning wheel of fire, is said to have felt it, for one brief moment, slow beneath him. It was, by every account that survives, the only moment of true rest that Tartarus had ever offered, or would ever offer again, to the suffering soul sentenced to its depths, for all eternity. A single afternoon of mercy, purchased entirely by the grief of one living man, willingly given to strangers he had never met and would likely never see again. And Hades, moved beyond his own understanding, granted the impossible. Eurydice would be released. She would follow behind Orpheus as he climbed back up out of the darkness, back through the long gray road, back across the river, back toward the world of light and living things. But there was a condition, and Hades made certain that Orpheus understood it completely before he set out. He must not look back at her. Not once, not for a single glance, not until both of them had stepped fully out into the sunlight of the world above. If he turned to look before that moment, if his eyes so much as flickered toward her before they had both crossed that final threshold together, she would be lost to him again. And this time, the old king made clear, there would be no second song beautiful enough to win her back a second time. Persephone, who as queen of that realm knew better than any god the particular ache of being pulled between two worlds, is said to have added her own quiet word of caution as they departed, not a warning against Orpheus's love, which she did not doubt, but a gentle reminder that the road up was long and dark, and that the mind, left alone with itself for that long in the black, has a way of turning even the surest love into a question. It seems on its face such a small thing to ask. Do not look back. Any one of us, hearing that condition calmly explained in a moment of safety, would surely say it sounds easy enough to keep. But consider what Orpheus was actually being asked to do. He was to climb, alone, up a long and winding road through utter darkness, with the one thing he had crossed the boundary of death itself to reclaim following somewhere behind him. And he was required, the entire way, to take it on faith that she was truly there. For the dead, the old stories tell us, make no sound as they walk. There would be no footsteps to reassure him. No breath he could hear over his own. Nothing at all, in fact, except the darkness ahead of him, and the silence behind him, and his own trust, stretched thinner and thinner with every single step, that Hades had kept his word, and that Eurydice was truly, actually, following him home. He found himself, more than once on that climb, slowing his steps, just slightly, listening for some small sound behind him. The brush of a robe against stone, a single soft breath, and, finding each time, only the vast and total silence of the dead, which told him nothing at all, neither that she was there, nor that she was not. A lesser man might have turned back at the very first of these silences. That Orpheus climbed on, step after step, mile after mile, carrying that unanswerable silence the entire way, is itself a kind of courage the old stories rarely give him proper credit for. It was not the courage of a man facing a monster he could see. It was the far harder courage of a man facing an uncertainty he could not. And so Orpheus began that climb. And it is here, in this long and lonely ascent, that the story stops being a tale of monsters and magic, and becomes something far more intimate and far more human. Up through the winding dark he went, past the gates where Cerberus had let him through, past the river where Charon had rowed him across, every step carrying him closer to the world of light, and every step, we must imagine, carrying him further into a private torment that no monster could have inflicted upon him. Was she truly there? Had the god of the dead, known throughout the whole of Greek belief for his absolute and unbending nature, simply been toying with him, offering a mercy he never intended to keep? Was the silence behind him the silence of a devoted wife, following faithfully in the dark, or the silence of an empty road, a promise already broken, a fool climbing alone toward a light he no longer had any reason to reach? Doubt, in this story, is not treated as a small human failing. It is treated as the true final trial of the entire journey. Harder, in its way, than charming the hound, harder than moving the heart of a god who had never once been moved. For the guardians of the underworld could be answered with music. But doubt cannot be strummed into silence. It has no ears to charm, no fur to soften. It lives entirely inside the mind of the one who carries it, and it grows heaviest exactly when a man is most alone, exactly in the dark, exactly when there is no one beside him to say, gently, I am still here. And this, perhaps, is the cruelest detail the old poets ever included in the entire tale, that the one condition capable of saving Eurydice was also, by its very nature, the one condition guaranteed to feed the exact fear it demanded Orpheus overcome. Ask a man not to look at the thing he most longs to see, for as long as he is uncertain whether it is even there at all, and you have not tested his love, you have built a trap out of it. And Orpheus, who had defeated Sirens with his song and softened the coldest heart in the underworld, with nothing but his voice and his lyre, found that the one enemy his music could not touch was the quiet, private fear inside his own chest. He climbed on, and the darkness around him began at last to change, the black growing to gray, the gray beginning to hold, somewhere far ahead, the faintest hint of true daylight. He was close. He could see at long last the opening of the cave that would carry them both back out into the living world, a pale circle of true sunlight, growing larger with every step he took toward it. He could feel it now, or believed he could, a faint warmth reaching him even through the cold stone air of the passage, the first true warmth he had felt since he had first entered this kingdom of the dead. Somewhere above him, birds were almost certainly singing, ordinary and unremarkable, the way they sing every single morning. For people who have never once had reason to doubt whether the sun would still be there when they opened their eyes. And it was here, at the very edge of triumph, so close to the world above that the old stories insist he could almost feel the warmth of the sun on his skin, that the doubt Orpheus had carried the whole way up finally became too heavy to bear in silence any longer. He stepped out of the cave, out into the full light of the living world, at last. But Eurydice, the old stories are careful to tell us, had not yet crossed that same threshold. She was still a few steps behind him, still within the shadow of the cave's mouth, still technically within the kingdom of the dead. And Orpheus, who had endured so much, who had outsung monsters and moved the heart of a god that had never once shown mercy, could not endure, in that final instant, the not knowing one moment longer. He turned. He looked back, and there she was, Eurydice, exactly as she had promised to be, following faithfully behind him the entire way, her eyes finding his in that single, final instant with what the old poets describe as more sorrow than blame. For just one heartbeat, they were both looking at each other again, two people who loved each other completely, reunited at last, after crossing the one boundary that should have kept them forever apart. And then, in the space of that same heartbeat, she was pulled backward, away from him, back down into the dark, her arms reaching toward him, even as the distance between them opened again, impossibly wide, impossibly fast. She spoke only a single word as she was drawn away, or so the old poets tell us. Farewell, and it was this time entirely and irreversibly final. Orpheus lunged back toward the cave, back toward the darkness, desperate to follow her down a second time. But the door that had opened for him once by a mercy no mortal had ever earned before would not open for him again. Charon would not row him across a second time. The road that had let him through with music now simply refused him, silent and immovable, no matter how he wept, no matter how he played. He is said to have remained at that threshold for 7 full days, neither eating, playing every song he had ever known into a darkness that no longer answered him at all, before his own grief and exhaustion finally forced him back out into a world of sunlight he no longer had any reason to want. Why did he look back? It is the question this story has left hanging for 3,000 years, and it is worth sitting with, rather than rushing past, because every answer we might offer says something true about what it means to love someone enough to nearly break the laws of death for them, and yet still be, in the end, only human. Perhaps it was simply love too impatient to wait one final moment. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of doubt, grown too heavy across that whole long, silent, uncertain climb. Perhaps, as some of the old philosophers who studied this story later suggested, it was something gentler and sadder still, that Orpheus in that instant needed to see her one more time, even more than he needed to bring her home, that love, at its most desperate, sometimes chooses the confirmation of the eye over the patience of faith, even when faith was the only thing being asked of it. Whatever the true reason, the old Greeks did not tell this story to mock him for it. They told it, I think, because they understood something true and difficult about grief, and about love, and about the particular kind of doubt that grows in the space where certainty used to live, that even the greatest heart in the world, capable of moving gods to tears, can still be undone by one single moment of simply needing to know. Orpheus returned to the world above utterly alone, carrying a grief now doubled by its own impossible almost. He had done what no mortal had ever done. He had come within a single step, a single heartbeat, of undoing death itself. And he had lost her anyway, at the very last possible moment, in a way that somehow made the loss heavier than if he had never attempted the journey at all. For now he knew, with absolute certainty, exactly how close he had come, and exactly what his own hand had cost him. He wandered after that, the old stories tell us, refusing all comfort. He crossed rivers he did not name, and mountains he did not remember, climbing, sleeping in whatever shelter the land happened to offer him, eating only when his body's own hunger finally overruled his grief. Shepherds who claimed to have seen him during these years described a man who seemed to be only partly present in the world around him, as though some larger portion of himself had simply stayed behind in that dark passage, still listening for footsteps that were never going to come. He would not remarry, though many women, moved by his sorrow and his fame, sought his company. He withdrew instead into the wild hills of Thrace, playing his lyre, now only for the animals and the rivers and the stones. His songs turned entirely to grief, so beautiful and so unbearably sad that it is said even the trees seemed to bow their branches lower as he passed among them. Travelers who happened across him in those wild years rarely spoke to him at all, not out of fear, but out of something closer to reverence, the same instinct that keeps a person quiet in the presence of a grief too large and too private to interrupt. He had once used his music to ask the universe for a miracle. Now he seemed to use it only to keep himself company in the silence the universe had answered him with instead. In the end, even this quiet, solitary grief was not permitted to simply fade peacefully away. Thrace, in those days, was also home to fierce devotees of the god Dionysus, women called Maenads, who practiced wild and ecstatic rites in his honor, given over entirely to a kind of sacred frenzy. Some of the old tellings say that Orpheus, in his grief, turned away from Dionysus of wild worship entirely and devoted himself instead to Apollo, god of order, music, and clear light, refusing the frenzied rites he had once, perhaps, taken part in, and that the Maenads, insulted by his rejection, or simply consumed by a frenzy beyond reason, one day found him in his solitary wandering, and tore him apart with their bare hands, scattering the pieces of him across the countryside, silencing forever the most beautiful voice the world had ever known. Other tellings say simply that his endless, inconsolable grief, and his refusal of every woman who might have eased it, provoked a fury he never intended and could not escape. Either way, the ending is the same. The man who had once outsung Sirens and moved the heart of death itself was destroyed, in the end, not by any monster, but by ordinary human passion. In the ordinary living world he had fought so hard, and so briefly, to return to. There is a strange mercy hidden even in this final cruelty, if you look for it. A man who had spent years wishing only to follow his wife back down into the silence of the dead was, at the very last, granted exactly that, not by any god's design this time, but by the ordinary chaotic violence of the world he had never truly wanted to keep living in. But even this, was not entirely the end of him. The old stories tell us that his head, still singing, or still somehow speaking, was carried by the river down to the sea, and washed ashore at last, on the island of Lesbos, an island that would, in the centuries that followed, become famous throughout Greece as a home of poets and musicians, as though something of that final unstoppable song had settled into its very soil. And his lyre, the same instrument that had charmed a three-headed hound and moved a god who had never before shown mercy, was placed by the gods among the stars, where it remains to this day as the constellation Lyra, small and quiet in the night sky, a permanent reminder that some music, once played, never entirely stops. And there is one final detail the old poets could not resist adding, small and quiet as it is. They say that when his head at last came to rest, and his shade descended once more into the underworld he had already visited once as a living man, he did not wander that gray country searching for her the way he once might have. He simply found her, waiting, and this time, they say, he walked beside her rather than ahead of her, and neither one of them ever needed to look back again, because in death at last there was no threshold left to fear losing her at. And so we return, at the very end, to the question this whole story was built around. What does it mean that the greatest musician who ever lived came so close to defeating death itself and lost everything anyway, in a single backward glance? I think the Greeks were telling us something quietly devastating about the limits of even the purest love. Orpheus's music could reach places that swords and armies and the boldest heroism could never reach. It could move monsters to lie down in peace. It could bring the coldest god in the whole of creation to tears. But it could not, in the end, silence the small human voice of doubt inside his own chest, whispering that he needed to know, right now, whether the impossible mercy he had been given was truly real. And perhaps that is the oldest and truest thing this story has to teach us. That love, however vast, however capable of miracles, is still carried by hands as fragile and as human as our own. That faith is very often the harder half of any miracle, harder even than the miracle itself. And that the line between winning back everything we have lost and losing it forever, a second time, can be as thin and as human and as forgivable as a single glance taken one moment too soon. We are, all of us, asked to make some version of this same climb at some point in our lives, to carry a hope we cannot verify, up through a darkness that offers no proof, trusting that what we love is still there behind us even when we cannot hear it breathing. Most of us are never given a God's clear condition to measure ourselves against, the way Orpheus was. We simply have to climb and trust and hope that we make it all the way into the light before the doubt in our own hearts asks us to turn around. Rest now. Let the music fade slowly, the way all true songs eventually do, not silenced, only resting. Somewhere just behind you, waiting quietly in the dark for the moment you are finally ready to stop looking back.